Hello and welcome to another lesson from Zechariah. In this particular lesson, we're going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4 of this particular book. This is which deals with the high priest in particular, the lampstand, as well as the olive trees. And this is a menorah that I took a picture of in Jerusalem in the Jewish quarter a few years ago. And so it'll be something like that when we get to the lampstand section. This is the outline that we're using. So this is our third lesson, deals with the fourth and the fifth visions. Baldwin says in the Tyndale Old Testament commentary that the first three visions, which we looked at in the last lesson, brought the prophet from a valley outside the city to a vantage point from which the dimensions of the original Jerusalem could be seen. In the fourth and fifth visions, he is in the temple courts, where the high priest officiated and had access to God's presence. These two visions concern Judah standing before God and her spiritual resources. So the next thing Zechariah sees is Joshua the high priest. This time the transition between visions isn't I looked again, it is next I saw. Net Bible Study Notes points out that Joshua the high priest mentioned here is the son of the priest Jehozadak, mentioned also in Haggai 1:1, and also several other references there. He also appears to have been the grandfather of the high priest contemporary with Nehemiah, around 445 BC. So this would make this Joshua the grandson of the high priest at the time the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Collins, in the New Bible Commentary, wrote that his grandfather Sariah is designated the chief priest. Jehozadak as it would be pronounced since there was no J sound until the 1700s, the son of Sariah, the father of Joshua, was taken away as prisoner to Babylon, where probably Joshua was born. The high priest was revived in Joshua after the captivity. Joshua, by the way, is known as Jeshua or Yeshua in Ezra. And we see as we open up here that Joshua was standing before the angel of Yahweh, and beside him, with him, was Satan, standing to accuse him. Baldwin writes, the scene is the heavenly courtroom, where the angel of the Lord, simply called the Lord in verse 2, represents God as judge, and Joshua, who in his official capacity as the high priest represents the Jews, stands as prisoner in the dock. His accuser is Satan, a transliteration of the Hebrew word meaning adversary. Homer Haley writes concerning this, the vision now shown to the prophet does not involve just one man, Joshua the high priest, but must be thought of as including the entire priesthood, and through them, the whole nation. Joshua stands for the priesthood, and the priesthood represented the people before Jehovah. Therefore, Satan's charge is against all, the priesthood and the nation. Satan, the adversary or accuser of men, would prevent Jehovah from accepting Joshua, and through him the nation would be denied favor with God because of sin. This is perhaps a good image to think of what Satan continues to do. He accuses us before God. Yahweh said to Satan, "May the Lord rebuke you." Homer Haley writes, Satan may have felt confident in his charge against Joshua, for whatever the present accusation may have been, the priesthood had been guilty of making no distinction between the holy and the common, between the clean and the unclean. We saw some of that as well in the book of Haggai. You may remember this phrase as well, may the Lord rebuke you, Satan, from one of the letters. If you remember in Jude, Verse 9 of Jude. But even the archangel, Michael the archangel, was arguing with the devil and debating with him concerning Moses' body. He did not dare to bring a slanderous judgment, but said, "May the Lord rebuke you." This seems to be God's reaction to Satan, as well as a reaction of those who are with God. No detailed arguing, just rebuke for what he was doing. Perhaps we need to adopt this at times. The Yahweh who had chosen Jerusalem rebuked him. This man Joshua, the text tells us, was like a burning stick snatched from the fire. Perhaps the idea is that he hadn't been consumed. There was still good left. Baldwin writes, the reference to a brand plucked from the fire recalls Amos 4:11. Evidently, this was a proverbial saying to indicate privileged deliverance from God's providential chastisements. It would seem that Satan was accusing him because of his filthy clothing. He wasn't the person he should have been. He stands before the judge, unable to help himself. The angel told those who were standing around Joshua to remove the filthy clothing. Most scholars identify those standing around him as other angelic beings, and the filthy clothes represent sin. Perhaps specifically the sin is that of neglecting God's temple, tying this in with the message of Haggai. The Net Bible Study Notes tells us that the Hebrew word that's translated filthy clothes really means excrement. This disgusting figure of speech suggests Joshua's absolute disqualification for priestly service in the flesh, but verse 2 speaks of his having been rescued from that deplorable state by God's grace. He's like a burning stick pulled out of the fire before it is consumed. This is a picture of cleansing, saving grace. And by the way, the fact that we find grace in the Old Testament scriptures should not surprise us. I know sometimes we remember the verse in John chapter 1 where it tells us that grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, and so it did. But God's grace is seen throughout the pages of Scripture. Jesus specifically brought grace to forgive our sins through his death on the cross. But we see God's grace throughout Scripture. And by the way, if you don't think it's God's grace we're seeing, then the question we have to ask ourselves is this: did these people earn it? Because they either earned it or it was given freely to them by God. And I don't think they earned it. God's grace is seen from Genesis all the way through to the book of Revelation. George Adam Smith writes in the book of the 12 Prophets, the uncleanness was not ethical failure, covetousness, immorality. It was, as Haggai protested, neglect of the temple and worship of Yahweh. If this be now removed in all fidelity to the law, the high priest shall have access to God, and the Messiah will come. So the angel told Joshua that he had forgiven his sin. He would once again be dressed in fine clothing. Baldwin writes, the vision demonstrated that God accepted Joshua, and with him those he represented, having removed from his sight all that offended his holiness. But that was not all. I will clothe you with rich apparel, promised garments suitable for the heavenly court, which it would have been beyond Joshua's power to provide. And Homer Haley writes, Satan misjudged the grace of God. He could not fathom a love that could and would forgive. Zechariah added, by the way, that Joshua needed a clean turban on his head. This was the headpiece that was worn by the high priest. It had a plate on it that was engraved with the inscription, Holy to the Lord. Although his sin had made him unholy, once forgiven, he would once again be made holy. I'm sure there's a lesson there for us as well, isn't there? So Joshua was clothed, given the clean turban, with the angel of Yahweh standing nearby. Jack Lewis wrote that the import of the vision is that the priesthood shall be cleansed and made acceptable for service. Now, Baldwin points out that though no satisfactory explanation was offered, there's not great detail here given as an explanation for this. The vision assured those who had repented, tying this back in with 1 verse 6, that sin had been put away and acceptance with God was granted. Then the angel of Yahweh exhorted Joshua solemnly. In other words, this is serious. This was important. And the message was directly from Yahweh of heaven's armies. There were some specific conditions that Joshua needed to meet. Some very things that he needed to do. He needed to follow or walk in God's ways. Now that implied a total commitment to God, to God's character, to God's intentions, and to reject anything that would compromise that commitment. Now, Bible Study Notes points out that the Hebrew word translated walk is a frequent biblical metaphor for lifestyle or conduct. Today's English version has, if you obey, and the contemporary English version adds, if you truly obey. To walk in the ways of the Lord is to live life as He intends. That is what the priesthood needed to do. And he also needed to keep God's requirements. This involved him faithfully keeping the rituals that God specified for the priests in leading in worship, as well as living a moral life. Haley points out that the charge is twofold. This involved, number one, the personal righteousness of the high priest, and number two, his faithfulness to his priestly duties. These he must solemnly observe. Then he would be allowed to preside over God's house and take care of the courtyards. God would allow him to come and go among those others who were standing by him. Now, those standing by him in this scene seem to be angelic beings. So Joshua, if that's the case, Joshua is being told that he would have direct access to be in God's presence, the same as the angels have. Haley writes, the charge is followed by a threefold promise involving serious responsibilities. Number one, thou shalt judge my house. That is, he will rule and direct the affairs and worship of Jehovah's house. Number two, and thou shalt also keep my courts, which is closely related to the first charge, but involves keeping the courts of Jehovah's house free from idols and all forms of idolatry. And number three, and I will give thee a place of access to Jehovah on behalf of the people whom the high priest represents. The Net Bible Study Notes points out that the statement, you'll be able to preside over my temple, Hebrew word is house there, which is a reference to the Jerusalem temple, is a hint of the increasingly important role the high priest played in the post-exilic Jewish community, especially in the absence of a monarchy. One thing we see historically is at this point in time there is a governor and there is a high priest. Later on, of course, we know that even Nehemiah was one of the governors. But that being governor fades out historically, whereas the high priest is the one that becomes not only the religious leader, but also the leader of the community of the Jews. The king previously had the authority in matters of worship. That may seem surprising, but we see that in 1 Kings 2 and 2 Kings 16 and 22 and other things. But from now on, it's going to be the Jewish high priest who had the authority. The literal Hebrew is that he would judge God's house, which carries with it the idea of a judicial function in addition to leading in worship. Baldwin writes, in all this, the person and work of Joshua's greater namesake, Jesus was being anticipated. The faithful high priest of the pre-Christian era entered into God's presence as the Christian does by grace through faith. The king. So this is where we're introduced to this idea of my servant, the branch. Joshua and his colleagues were a symbol that God was about to introduce his servant, the branch. And both that term, my servant, and also the branch, identify this as referring to the coming Messiah. That Bible Study Notes points out that the collocation of servant and branch gives double significance to the messianic meaning of the passage. There's a lot of other messianic usages of these terms, which you can look up later on. But this is Zechariah's first mention of the branch who was to come. And an image that both Isaiah and Jeremiah had talked about. He would be a descendant of David, as well as being a servant of Yahweh. And again, the idea of a servant is something especially that is emphasized by Isaiah. In him, the priesthood and kingship through Zerubbabel will be combined and made complete. Haley writes, what God had just done in assuring the priesthood a place of access to him would find its full and ultimate realization in the branch. These would be a sign or assurance of future completeness of access under the full and complete high priest. The high priest and his fellows were typical of the righteous branch to come. So we've got sort of what we often refer to as type and antitype going on here. There was also a stone set before Joshua, which had 7 eyes. I think we see some numerology, number symbolism coming in here. In numerology, 7 indicates completeness and perfection. Many take the view that the stone is also the Messiah. That could be, although it might not be as well. Now, Bible Study Notes said that the stone is also a metaphor for Messiah. A foundation stone that at first rejected will become the chief cornerstone of the church. And that's a possibility. But although the Messiah is referred to as a stone in both the Jewish scriptures and in the Gospels and letters, this may not be the best interpretation here, as God's coming kingdom is also referred to in the prophets as a stone which grew and filled the whole earth. You remember, that's the figure we see there in Daniel chapter 2. Haley writes, it has been revealed to the prophet that Jehovah's servant, the branch, would be brought forth, in whom is to be commended the office of king and priest. It seems evident from the context that the stone is the kingdom of Jehovah. At that time, it was a rough, unhewn stone, but it was to be complete with the engraving or sculpture of Jehovah. And I think that Haley's idea here is the right idea. That there are 7 eyes which represent the completeness and fullness of God's watchful care over his people, as well as his promise that he would bring forth a kingdom which would never be destroyed and would endure forever despite the opposition that it would encounter. God was about to engrave an inscription on the stone. And although we don't in this text have the inscription given word for word, it had to do with God removing of the sin of the land in a single day. And what better way would there be to describe what the Messiah came to the earth to do, particularly in his death on the cross. And that day, everyone would invite their friends to fellowship under his vine and under his fig tree. Haley points out that under one's vine and fig tree was a symbol of peace, enjoyed in the midst of safety and security, promised by Jehovah through Micah in the kingdom of the Messiah. I think that's a good tie-in there with what's going to be going on in the kingdom. Baldwin writes, while every man would have a place to call his own, his joy would be to share it with others, and loneliness would be a thing of the past. And that's the result of the forgiveness that all have through the Messiah. It's very similar to the images we have in the latter part of Isaiah. Haley points out that this is the assurance Jehovah gives to his discouraged and faltering people through the cleansing of the priesthood and declaration of the branch who would come, and through the promise of the kingdom over which he carefully watched. And that leads us then into chapter 4, which we have another picture going on. The angelic messenger who had been talking with him returned and woke him up as someone is awakened from sleep. However, Haley wrote that apparently the prophet had been so overcome by the previous 4 visions that he'd fallen into a sleep-like exhaustion. For the interpreting angel came again and waked me as a man is wakened out of his sleep. Again indicates that this was not the first time during the night that the angel had aroused him, although it's the first mention of such action. So he gets him back into knowing what's going on again. He asked Zechariah what he saw. This seems to be the introduction of the next vision. So instead of Zechariah asking the angel what it was that he saw, the angel asked Zechariah what he saw. Well, Zechariah's reply was that he saw a lampstand, or a menorah as we would call it today, of pure gold with a receptacle at the top. Now this menorah is different, both to the one made for the tabernacle and the 10 Solomon made for the temple, and the one I showed you in the picture as we began. There was a reservoir on the top, and the 7 lamps had 7 pipes going to them, apparently from the reservoir. And we're going to see as this image progresses that the reservoir was fed by 2 olive trees. Seemed to have the idea that it would keep the flames burning perpetually. There were 2 olive trees beside it, one on the right, one on the left, that were providing the oil. Now, the Net Bible Study Notes suggests that a pipe from each olive tree was going to each lamp for a total of 14 pipes, possibly, but possibly not. Others suggest that there were 7 pipes going to each lamp for a total of 49 pipes. The Hebrew literally there is 7 sevens of pipes. Others suggest there were just 7 pipes. And that one's one that makes sense to me as I try to picture this in my mind. Although we should keep in mind what Homer Haley wrote about this. He said, men have exercised their ingenuity and drawn on their imagination in an effort to construct a picture of the bowl and its relation to the lamps. But they have had little success. It's very difficult to try to picture this in our mind, because just as soon as you think you have the picture, something else shows up and it sort of disqualifies it. By the way, John saw a similar image in Revelation 11. I emphasize there it's similar, it's not the same. Although what he saw was 2 olive trees and 2 menorahs. Although he could describe what he saw, Zechariah didn't know what it meant. So he asked the messenger, what are these? In other words, what do these mean? The response is, don't you know what they are? Zechariah responds, no, sir. Now keep in mind that he would never have seen either the menorah in the temple or the tabernacle. Although he had never seen them, he should have known something about them from the scriptures, but not what the one he saw in the vision meant. The angel then gave him an explanation. He said that this was the Lord's message to Zerubbabel through Zechariah. And the message was this: not by strength and not by power, but by my spirit. Now keep in mind, why Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel was the one that was to rebuild the temple. And so it's a reassurance to Zerubbabel. Haley writes, in the angel's reply, we have an explanation of the purpose of the vision. It's a message to the despairing Zerubbabel. No doubt, as he viewed the task before him of rebuilding the temple and the temper and weakness of the people, he had become discouraged. A word of assurance from Jehovah would be his greatest need. The word for strength here is footnoted in some translations as army. That's an interesting idea. But I think the whole idea we're supposed to get from this little phrase, not by strength and not by power, but by my spirit, was that Zerubbabel wouldn't succeed in building the temple by human strength or anything else that humans rely on. Power, armies, whatever. It's going to be by God's Spirit, by God's power. That's the way that he would be successful. So this part of the message was encouragement to Zerubbabel to keep on and not give up rebuilding the temple. A great mountain, then it tells us, would become a level plain because of Zerubbabel. Again, the Net Bible Study Notes points out that in context, the great mountain here must be viewed as a metaphor for the enormous task of rebuilding the temple and establishing the Messianic kingdom. It points out that today's English version uses obstacles as great as mountains. I think that does make sense there. So what's being said here? Well, Zerubbabel would be able to overcome whatever obstacle he was facing and would level them. He would bring the temple capstone with shouts of grace, grace. And by the way, depending on your translation, you get all sorts of things listed there. Net Bible has grace, grace. NIV, by the way, puts in God bless it, God bless it. Because the temple capstone. And by the way, the idea of the temple capstone here is that this would be the last stone to be laid in the temple. So he'd bring it, and when that would happen, there would be great rejoicing, and he would realize it wasn't by his own power, but by the power of God that he was able to overcome all the obstacles in front of him. This capstone's that final stone which would hold the entire arch together. Homer Haley writes, as the last stone is properly placed, the building completed, the multitude gathered for the occasion will break forth in jubilant prayer for God's favor to rest upon it. When completed, it would have been built by the grace of God. And the prayer would be that it would continue under the divine favor, never again to be destroyed. And I'm sure that's what they were praying. And although that would have been the prayer, we realize that temple didn't last either, did it? It's not there today. Sadly, the people did not remain faithful. They rejected God's Messiah when he came, and that resulted in the temple's complete destruction. But Yahweh's message, which came to Zechariah, was this. Zerubbabel's hands had laid the foundation of God's house, and he would complete it. The same hands would do the completion. And then he would know that Yahweh of heaven's armies had sent his angel to them. Homer Haley points out, though there's more to it than that, but more, it would also be a pledge that the greater spiritual house would be building according to the divine promise and power. For Zerubbabel was made as a signet, chosen by Jehovah, according to Haggai chapter 2, verse 23, a symbol of him who is to come. His work was a foreshadowing of what the Messiah would accomplish. When this was all finished, who would dare to make light of such a small beginnings? If you think about this beginnings of the temple, when the foundation was laid, the people wept because the insignificance of what they were doing in comparison with what Solomon built. We find that in Ezra chapter 3, verse 12. And when they began again 15 years later to rebuild the temple, it seemed to those involved as nothing. Haggai tells us that in chapter 2, verse 3. All the things done since returning from the exile to the coming and work of the Messiah were small in comparison to his work. But when the work is Jehovah's work, predetermined and carried out by him, nothing is inconsequential. Everything has its place in his plan. So in other words, it may have started small, but it was going to have a great ending. Jack Lewis wrote that despite the difficulties now on the way, Zerubbabel, who had laid the foundation, will complete the capstone amidst applause. One should not despise the day of small things. Then we find in the text that these 7 eyes would look joyfully on the 10 tablet in Zerubbabel's hand. At least that's the way the Net Bible renders it. There's all sorts of different ways that this is rendered, because this is a difficult one to translate. The Net Bible Study Notes says, as in 3:9, the idea is God's omniscience. He who knows the end from the beginning rejoices at the completion of his purposes. The NIV, by the way, puts here the chosen capstone in the hand of Zerubbabel. Some translations, in fact, most of them, have plumb line in his hand. But that doesn't seem to be the meaning here, because you wouldn't necessarily use a plumb line at something when something's finished. You use that as it's being built. Net Bible Study Notes point out that this term is traditionally translated plumb line, but it's more likely that the Hebrew word is derived not from to divide, but from a root meaning 10. And they point out this finds support in the ancient Near Eastern custom of placing inscriptions on tin plates in dedicatory foundation deposits. But we have the idea of these 7 eyes being the eyes of Yahweh, which are constantly watching the whole earth. As Haley says, the 7 eyes that run to and fro through the whole earth symbolize the perfection of God's watch over his purpose and the carrying out of his plan. Zechariah then asked about the olive trees. He now at least understands the significance of the menorah and being the assurance that Zerubbabel would complete the work. But before he could get an answer about the olive trees, he also asked about the 2 extensions of the olive trees, which were emptying the golden oil through 2 golden pipes. Bible Study Notes again, the usual meaning of the Hebrew term is ears. Here it probably refers to the produce of the olive trees, olives. Many English versions render the term as branches. New American Bible, tufts, translated there. But if you think about it, this must have been quite a sight. A menorah, a lampstand that had its own oil supply. Wouldn't we want to know what it all was? We would have asked, I'm quite certain, the same questions. Homer Haley writes that truths can be revealed in a vision or dream that could never be found in actual life. Olive berries do not of themselves drop oil, but must be pressed. In a vision, this is not necessary. The picture is one of the completeness of God's Spirit by which the light of truth would be shed abroad in his temple. And I think Haley's got some good ideas there. Zechariah was again asked, don't you know what these are? To which he replied, no, sir. And he was told that these are the 2 appointed, anointed ones who stand by Yahweh of the whole earth. Now, the 2 anointed ones here would be Joshua and Zerubbabel. And there's good reason for that. Again, the Net Bible Study Notes. The usual word for anointed one is not used here, but it's a different word that literally means sons of fresh oil. This is to maintain consistency with the imagery of olive trees. In the immediate context, these 2 olive trees should be identified with Joshua and Zerubbabel, the priest and the governor. Only the high priest and king were anointed for office in the Old Testament, and these two were respectively descendants of Aaron and David. So why are these the anointed one? Joshua, because he would have been the anointed high priest, and Zerubbabel, because he was a descendant of King David. And kings also were anointed. George Adam Smith wrote that one thing is remarkable. The two sources of revelation are king and priest. The prophet is not mentioned. Nothing could prove the sense in Israel that prophecy was exhausted. Zerubbabel was the civic head of the community. Joshua was the religious head for the Jews. But the role of prophet was very soon dying out. And it would be with a few further years with Malachi that prophecy ended until we get to the time of John, just before the coming of the Messiah. Joyce Baldwin points out that two messiahs or anointed ones have their roles coordinated. Neither is adequate without the other. They were equal in dignity and importance. After the death of Zerubbabel, the high priest was to increase in temporal power, for the governors of Jerusalem declined in importance. But the promises to the house of David were not forgotten. The people of Qumran expected two messiahs, one priestly and one from David. But the two functions were to be brought together in the person and work of Christ. Haley points out that the two offices would be ultimately united in the Messiah, the priest-king to come. However, discussion of this point would be premature just here, so the angel leaves this to be dealt with later in chapter 6, and we'll mention that again when we get to chapter 6. Again, Baldwin writes, we'll conclude our lesson with this. The main purpose of the vision is to encourage the two leaders, Joshua and Zerubbabel, with a reminder of God's resources and to vindicate them in the eyes of the community. They were God's appointed leaders, and God would be with them. Let's think just for a second as we close with lessons that we can learn from this particular text. And going back to what we saw in chapter 3, Satan may accuse us before God, but see, we have an advocate who speaks for us. Jesus himself. John writes that in his first letter. He's the one who paid the price for our sin. And also this idea of senseless arguments with people. We need to learn from the reaction to Satan. Now, we may not want to say to somebody, the Lord rebuke you, but we should keep that sentiment in mind before getting involved in needless antagonistic discussions. We need to remember that we have, in a real sense, God's grace that forgives our sin. Now, we see God's grace throughout Scripture, but in a real way, forgiveness and grace came through Jesus. And that's the love, of course, that God has for us. By the way, the image in Galatians 3 is that when we're immersed, we put on Jesus, like putting on new clothes. Another lesson is that the work we do for the kingdom may seem to us to be insignificant. We need to remember that any work done for the Lord is not insignificant. It is significant to Him. And finally, a lesson that we see so frequently throughout the prophets is that God is in control. God is aware of what's going to happen in the future. He's controlling what was happened then. God is in control. May we give God control of our lives. Thank you for joining us for this particular lesson, and we hope that you can join us again for the next lesson.